The very first Academy Award ceremony arrived in 1929, at a moment when the process of talking pictures was so new that there was only one viable commodity to reward that had been successfully wired with the new technology. That, according to the Academy's original board of judges, gave the jazz singer an unfair advantage. With that, it was decided to disqualify it from the Best Picture race, then called Outstanding Production, but still acknowledged its contribution with a special award. In Oscar's second year, all bets were off. Almost every nominee was wired for sound in one way or another, but the technology was still so wonky that only one film stood out from the pack. The Broadway Melody would become the best-selling movie of the year, but the rolling tide of improvements in sound in years to come would devalue its contribution. In time, it would largely fade away. Hello and welcome to the Best Picture winners, a full-on survey of the films Oscar crowned as the best of the year. My name's Jerry, and I'll be looking at each film from each year of the Academy's first century and the people and events surrounding it. This time we're looking at the Broadway Melody, the first sound film to be bestowed Oscar's top prize, and the difficult process of making it happen. As soon as movies began to talk, they inevitably began to sing. However, much like a child learning to speak, film had to find the sounds and then perfect the words. But it took time and practice and work. Wiring the entire industry for sound meant not only altering the technology of filmmaking, but it changed how actors had to perform and how writers had to build a narrative. The idea of writing full pages of dialogue was a new idea. Before movies could talk, there was a basic story, and the dialogue was clipped into short bursts, simple enough to place on a title card, the variation of which was only a few seconds. Silent films were largely a visual medium, and the emotions and the drama came from the visual language provided by the actors. This didn't mean that silent films were inferior, but the induction of sound into the industry was so fast and took such a hold on the movie-going public that it might have been easy to think of them as dated. Many prints of silent films were simply thrown away or just left in studio storage to rot. There was never a thought that they would be treasured. The experiments in sound were nothing new. The transition to sound was a very long process reaching back to the turn of the century when movies were born. After 1877, Thomas Edison had an obsession with sound after having produced it on a phonograph. By the end of the century, he had wanted to produce it into motion pictures, but his work never got beyond a pliable theory. He had developed the kinescope, which could synchronize via a belt drive between two machines, but it never took off, and other experiments fared only slightly better throughout the first 30 years of motion picture production. Fox and Warner Brothers led the charge in the late 1920s to the induction of sound. Both studios adapted telephone and radio research into technology that could be used in wiring film for sound. So when the revolution happened, they were ready. But the change was so fast that the consideration of how they were to be made was still being experimented as the films were being pushed into theaters. The results were often spotty at best. Even writing a script had to be reconsidered, since the script now had to include dialogue, which had previously been provided by title writers. But who would write them? By the early 30s, studio executives offered contracts to playwrights, authors, and newspaper writers who could write sharp dialogue, out of which came Aldous Huxley, Robert Sherwood, William Faulkner, and Dorothy Parker. Of course, pooling talent was easy, but getting technology to behave was another matter. Early talking pictures were rough. Actors spoke in awkward, flat monotones punctuated by gaps in dialogue.
I'd like a word with you, Dr. Bassan.
As the directors overseeing their performance seemed to forget that the visual element had to also have sound to back it up. This was before the development of ambient music. As parodied later in Singin' in the Rain, early sound equipment was bulky. Microphones were hidden close to the actors, making for weird gestures. In the film, starlet Lena Lamont is forced to take diction lessons to improve her speaking ability. In reality, this created an even more awkward manner of speaking, as actors were required to speak more slowly.
Take him for a ride. Oh.
Making the dialogue feel slow and unnatural. And when it wasn't slow, there were just awkward pauses. The picture itself didn't fare well either. Aspect ratios were squared off, cameras panned slowly, and actors were often cut out of the frame. As seen in Singin' in the Rain, the actor had to be close to the microphone, very often in a nearby prop. When a scene called for an actor to move around the set, the microphones had to be strategically placed, sometimes overhead. If the actor moved out of range of the microphone, the sound wasn't recorded. And adding misery to misery, the early microphones were generally the same microphones used on radio, wherein radio actors performed only with their voices and didn't have to move around. The problem for actors and directors in a film was that those microphones were omnidirectional, meaning that they picked up all of the sound in the room, including the loud noises emanating from the camera equipment. The temporary solution was to isolate the camera in a soundproof booth, which was about the size and shape of a telephone booth. This solved some of the problems with sound, but it severely limited where the camera person could move the camera around. The solution, developed by cinematographer John Arnold, was to ditch the booth idea and house the camera inside a floating soundproof blimp. This meant that the camera could move, but it was also extremely heavy and unwieldy. The solution to that problem was an idea that had been developed by D.W. Griffith earlier for the film Intolerance: the camera crane. Griffith's idea was commandeered by special effects engineer A.G. Subaraya, who would later go on to help create the Godzilla and Ultraman series. He reduced the size of the crane and made it out of wood using no blueprints or manuals. The result was a technique still in use today. But even as these technological experiments were being developed, the studio chiefs were forcefully pushing them into theaters. Their studios rushed to wire anything for sound, which, by 1929, had resulted in a series of quickly made musical reviews devoid of plot and filmed in the wee hours of the morning on studio sound stages. Most of these reviews were just a plotless hodgepodge of studio contract players shoved in front of a camera to sing and dance whether they had any musical ability or not. Paramount had Paramount on Parade, Fox had Fox Movie Tone Follies, and MGM had the Hollywood Review of 1929. MGM also had the Broadway Melody, and it succeeded in being slightly different. For one thing, it had a plot, the story of the Mahoney sisters, a singing-dancing duo who bring their vaudeville act to Broadway and, predictably, wend their way through a series of dramatic ups and downs. It would be MGM's first musical, and the first all-talking musical, and it would be an enormous hit. At Oscar time, it netted 3 nominations: Best Actress for Bessie Love, Best Director for Harry Beaumont, and its only win for Best Picture. Good things happened to the Broadway Melody on its release in February of 1929. The money rolled in, the Oscar rolled in, however, time would wash it away. Rarely screened today, the Broadway Melody suffers under the weight of its unformed and unwieldy technology. The production was difficult in that technicians wiring the film for sound had to keep changing the sets to get the best sound, and that led to a great deal of reshoots. Much of this can be seen in the film as the actors are forced to stand in place and do unnecessary close-ups just to stay in range of the microphones. The opening scene is the most obvious as Charles King sings the title tune with his body language that suggests that his feet are nailed to the floor. Plus, as advantageous as it was to have the story grafted onto a musical with sound, it wasn't the most earth-shattering narrative in the world. The Mahoney sisters, Hank and Queenie, played by Bessie Love and Anita Page, arrive in New York where they're needed by their friend Eddie Kearns, played by King, for a show put on by producer Francis Zanfeld, a thinly veiled reference to Florence Ziegfeld. Eddie loves Hank, but she's being courted by Jock Warner, a thinly veiled reference to Jack Warner, who is a member of New York's high society scene. Way too much time passes before Queenie realizes that Jock wants her for arm candy, and it takes Hank way too long to realize that Eddie really loves Queenie. But aside from that, because the movie relied so heavily on technological advances, one is forced to focus on this threadbare story. The sound is fine compared with its contemporaries, and there is a historical note here in that one number, The Wedding of the Painted Doll, was an early experiment in Technicolor provided by Kodak magnate George Eastman, but the experiment failed, and what survives is only in black and white. What survives is, much like the rest of the film, a rinky-dink number that's dusty and dated. The Broadway Melody exists only really as a curiosity, a historical footnote. It is rarely screened, and the few who seek it out don't give it much sanction. The song seems far out of date and out of tune. For Armchair Cinema, I'm Jerry Dean Roberts. Thank you for joining us.
It's a holiday today, the wedding of the painted doll.